I'm Christy Urbanik, and this is Isabel's case. Isabel's story is that Isabel is or was a 10-year-old girl at the time of her hearing. She actually moved to Iowa from Colorado. She was from Castle Rock, Colorado, where she was born, and she spent kindergarten, first, and second grade in Colorado. In the summer of 2004, her family moved to Urbandale, and Isabel was going to enter into the Waukee Community School District. In Colorado, in kindergarten, first, and second, she had an IEP. She also had a behavioral intervention plan or a behavioral support plan. And actually, right before they moved to Iowa, they had developed a new IEP in Colorado too. And some of the behaviors that they were concerned about were that she talked to herself or inanimate objects. She lived in an alternative world. She had difficulty relating to people. She isolated herself from her peers. She was aggressive with extreme emotions, and she also perseverated. Her behavioral goals that were made on that IEP were developed, and they were for acceptable touch, tolerance of flexibility in her routines, and for coping with social demands. So when she came to the Waukee School District, the parents met with representatives from the school, and they talked about kind of the needs that Isabel would need at the beginning of the year. At that point, the parents actually requested that she repeat second grade, even though she had finished second grade in Colorado. And so she started in a functional skills classroom, and the parents were told that she would have kind of a typical inclusion schedule, which meant she would basically go to like daily math and daily oral language. She would go to PEs and specials, and then she would spend time also in the functional skills classroom. After 5 days in that functional skills classroom, the teachers met with AEA reps and decided to move her to a higher academic functional skills classroom. So she was moved into a new classroom. And then after a couple weeks, they met to create an interim IEP. And so that was developed in 2004 in September. And at that time, she was having such success at school, the team decided that they would not put a behavior plan in. Even though she had had a behavior plan in Colorado, and the parents had even said that they thought it would probably be a good idea if they had a behavior plan, they decided not to put one in at that point with the interim IEP. It was an interim IEP because she hadn't been determined eligible for special ed in Iowa yet. The rest of that fall, it kind of got worse for Isabel. She started experiencing some behavioral difficulties. And they didn't have a plan, obviously, in place. So some of the difficulties she ran into, she would be asked to do things and she wouldn't do them. She would be yelling or screaming, and she would just run into a lot of problems with that. She would spend a lot of time in one-on-one instruction. She would be pulled out of her general ed, and so she didn't always get to go to her inclusive environment. And so she spent a lot of time kind of isolated at her desk or in one-on-one instruction. And so in November, when it came time to make her actual IEP, they decided to put a behavioral support plan in place also. And in that behavioral support plan, they decided that they would use hand-over-hand interventions, and also they may use restraint holds that happened to be used. I don't believe that part was actually in the behavioral support plan, but the hand-over-hand interventions was. So that it took her from about December to February. They were using the hand-over-hand support or interventions quite regularly, and it was something that they were starting to kind of hold her down, restrain her. It became not just hand-over-hand, but it was kind of definitely a restraint. And so she had a lot of struggles, again, between kind of December and February. In the spring, she actually had a home notebook that would go home, and it actually gave a number of dates that were actually really good or great, they even said, that she had. So there was just kind of a mixed bag of sometimes it was really good, and then she kind of ended the year pretty well. In the fall of 2005, though, it got considerably worse. The hand-over-hand interventions were getting more and more difficult to do. They were also being prolonged as time. So they were a very long time that they were actually going through this intervention, and it wasn't helping, and her behaviors were getting worse, or the number of them was increasing. So in the fall of 2005, they started using timeout involving body basics. So she basically had to do or sit in the position that they were asking her to sit in or do body basics in timeout for a specific number of minutes, whether 2 to 3 or 5 minutes. And then she also had to do kind of an arbitrary task showing that she would do what she was being asked to do. And then she could come back. So she basically had to earn her way back into the classroom or definitely back into integration. So she was being isolated into the timeout. She was being put into kind of a closet. They actually termed it Isabel's office after a while. And basically when she would have a fit or be disruptive or refuse to do something or refuse to choose, she would be put into this closet or her office, and everything would be taken out of there because it was also a place where she would go to work. She would lose all of her stuff that she would be able to, they thought, maybe harm herself. And she would be left in there, and she was asked to sit quietly in body basics, and they would set a timer, and they would check every minute to see if she was doing it or to remind her, and if she wasn't, then they would reset the timer. And so those began to be very long. Sometimes they were short, but sometimes they were extremely long, and they definitely caused her to be more and more isolated. And so they were using this timeout instead of hand over hand. And the timeout interventions were used almost daily throughout December. And the durations, I have a list of them there, but they were kind of a crazy amount of time that she was being spent in isolation. And sometimes more than once a day. So there were days that she would go in and out of that isolation or that timeout room or her office, whatever they wanted to call it. The timeouts continued to be used, and eventually, I think it was in November of that same year, in 2005, they actually put those into her IEP. But when they were actually put in place at the beginning of the year, they were not on her behavior intervention plan. The parents in this case, the parents of Isabel, are claiming a few things. The Waukee Community School District and Heartland AEA have violated the LRE provision of the IDEA. They did not provide the least restrictive environment for Isabel, they feel, and they did not provide the supplemental aids that she would need to be successful in the general ed classroom. They feel that there were 2 procedural violations that impacted the provision of a FAPE to Isabel. And those were the placement decisions restricting Isabel's inclusion were made without including the general education teacher. This was something that showed up a few times in the description of the case. The general education teacher wasn't at some of the meetings, and then in fact was at one and left before the goals were made at another. So in and out, but mostly not there and didn't give much input to the goals or the accommodations. Also, parental requests for greater inclusion were denied without providing written prior notice. The parents are also claiming that the Waukee Community School District and Heartland AEA implemented seclusionary timeout and other intrusive behavioral interventions that were inconsistent with substantive and procedural rights under the IDEA, and the interventions were implemented without prior written notice and/or false or misleading notice. And again, they knew the hand over hand, it was in the behavioral support plan, but they didn't really know how it was being used or definitely not the duration of it. And then the timeout was kind of in place of the hand over hand when it was more and more difficult to do. And it was used consistently without letting the parents know. And again, they didn't know about it at that time, and they definitely didn't know the duration. These parents also are claiming these interventions resulted in harm to Isabel. They actually said that she had post-traumatic stress disorder and failed to meet a standard of care implicit in offering appropriate educational programs. The court decisions, and these are all kind of followed by the applicable federal or Iowa laws or rules. The court decided that there was insufficient consideration given to the supplementary aids and services, which may have promoted a less restrictive placement for Isabel. So they really didn't look into much on how they could have made it work better in the classroom. They really were focusing on kind of reacting to her behaviors, and they kept pulling her more and more out of the general education classroom and started trying to figure out ways that she could be included. Access to general education cannot be predicated on a child's ability to perform on par with non-disabled peers. One of the things that happened when they were talking about her first IEP in that first November of second grade is that they said that she was so far behind that she just couldn't catch up and she would never be at grade level. And that's just not something that can pull them out of general education. They can't be required to be at or on par with their non-disabled peers. there has to be some supplements or some aids that they can think of to help them be in the general education classroom. Isabel's IEP team is required to consider what supports Isabel would need to benefit in the general education classroom. Kind of said that towards the beginning, and why the supplementary aids and supports cannot be provided. So if it's not something that they can do, they needed to say why. But they really didn't consider the different kind of supports that would help her be successful in the classroom. Really, the focus was on getting her to behave the way they wanted her to. A student should not have to earn his way into an integrated school setting by first functioning successful in a segregated setting. And this has actually come from another court decision. They definitely made it apparent that when Isabel was disruptive or was not behaving the proper way, that she had to show the correct behavior or she wouldn't be allowed back into the either the general education classroom or just back into the special education classroom with her. Insufficient effort was given to the consideration of supplemental aids and services for Isabel's inclusion in regular education. So they hadn't spent definitely enough consideration to figure out how to make it successful in general education. Isabel's placement in the functional skills classroom was a violation of her LRE mandate and definitely wasn't the least restrictive environment. The absence or limited involvement of the regular educator cannot be dismissed as a harmless error. This was definitely something that they just kind of pushed around and kind of said that he was there and then maybe not there. And it was definitely something that was missing and his input was missing. And so that was something that was a violation. The behavioral interventions provided to Isabel were not in conformity with the IEP and were in violation of federal and Iowa law requirements. They were not helping her. The excessive durations of the timeout interventions were not consistent with applicable research finding and appropriate educational practices or based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable. They definitely, the duration of them, they were not causing behavior to get better. In fact, they were causing behavior to get worse. And there was not any really monitoring of it or data that was pulled in to say if it's working or not. That was definitely kind of a concern. The emphasis on consequent reactive interventions for Isabel was neither proactive nor effective. Again, they weren't working. And then the last thing, court decided that the parents had failed to show that Isabel had post-traumatic stress disorder. Or that the behavioral interventions caused or contributed to a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. In my personal view, I definitely agree with the court on the findings. It was pretty obvious that what they were doing was not helping, but it was definitely something that they weren't monitoring really, or at least there was no data that showed that they were monitoring it, and they weren't really coming back together to see if they could fix it. It was escalating, it was definitely getting worse, and they just kind of kept reacting to whatever the next thing was. What I find difficult to understand is that fact itself. They saw that the behaviors were not getting any better. They saw that the behaviors were in fact getting worse, but then continued to try the same thing or in fact more of the same thing. Try it longer, thinking that was going to help or that was going to make things better. So it was really difficult for me to understand the thinking behind it. And sometimes it's easier to read this and kind of take that perspective than when you're inside of it. But it's hard for me to grasp why you would continue doing something that it's evident that it's not working. Implications for school teams, definitely when something isn't working, come together again, make changes, see if you can get it to be better. But while you're doing that, make sure that you're collecting data and monitoring it so you know if it's working or not. There's really only way to know if it's working or not is to monitor it or collect data. Communication with parents is vital, but it also must be complete. I don't think they were saying everything or communicating everything. And one of the questions I had through this, and maybe it just wasn't said, is where were the administrators? It seems like this was a very violent kind of thing or something that was really hopefully out of the ordinary. It seems like the administrators should have been a little more in on it and maybe even walking through the classroom more. The questions I have for you are, one, what types of interventions could you see putting in place for Isabel that might have prevented some of her behaviors, maybe being a little more proactive instead of reactive? At what point, if you were the team or especially the special ed teacher, would you think it would have been reasonable to step back and say, this is probably not the best intervention, and what steps would you take next? And then 3, this is one that I kind of had for myself too. Are there interventions you've used in your classroom in the past, academic or behavioral, that you found weren't helping, but you continued with the intervention anyway? I know that I can think of some that I just continued to do. And why do you think educators do this?